What if Africa was never colonized? What if the story you know about the world was completely different? What if the history of power, technology, and culture did not flow only from Europe or Asia, but from the beating heart of Africa? Imagine a world where Africa stood tall, unbroken, and united. Imagine a world where kings and queens ruled without interruption, where the land's riches stayed with its people, and where the dreams of millions were not stolen by foreign hands. The world you know today would not look the same. It would not sound the same. It would not even feel the same. This is the world that could have been if Africa was never colonized. In this world, the ancient empires of Mali, Songhai, Benin, Great Zimbabwe, and Congo would not have fallen to outsiders. They would have grown stronger. Generation after generation, Mali, with its golden wealth, would have become the world's financial capital. The city of Timbuktu, already known for its libraries and scholars, would have rivaled Oxford and Cambridge in fame. Only bigger, richer, and brighter African mathematics. Astronomy and medicine would have shaped science in every corner of the globe. Instead of being hidden or destroyed by colonizers, Great Zimbabwe, with its giant stone walls and mysterious towers, would have risen higher and higher, becoming a city of skyscrapers before New York or London ever dreamed of such things. Benin would have filled the world with its bronze art so perfect that it looked like it came from the future. Only this time, the art would not be stolen and locked in foreign museums. It would remain in Africa as a symbol of power. The Ashanti Empire would have expanded across West Africa, building trade networks that reached into the Americas, Asia, and Europe, not as colonies, but as equal partners in exchange. Ships from Africa would dock in ports across the world, carrying gold, ivory, spices, salt fabrics, and technology designed by African minds. African languages would spread far and wide. Swahili, Yoruba, Amharic, and Hausa might be global languages. Taught in every school, children in Europe might grow up learning African stories of Anansi or Shaka instead of only Greek myths. The African drumbeat would not just echo in hidden corners. It would become the sound of global celebration music, rooted in African rhythms. Would shape classical tradition, not just modern ones. Imagine if the slave trade never happened. Millions of Africans would not have been taken from their homes. Families would not have been torn apart. Entire villages would not have been erased. Instead, those people would have stayed building cities, farming lands, creating art, writing books, and leading nations. The African diaspora in the Americas would not have come through chains and suffering. It would have come through free trade migration and exploration. African explorers would have sailed to the Americas and Asia as leaders, not captives. What would America look like without slavery? What would the Caribbean look like without plantations? Maybe the United States would not have grown into the superpower it is today because it was built on forced African labor. Maybe instead, Africa itself would be that superpower. Cities like Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Johannesburg would be as famous as Paris or Tokyo or Dubai. They would shine with futuristic towers, trains, and highways designed by African engineers, powered by African resources. The wealth of oil, gold, diamonds, and the fertile soil would not leave the continent. It would stay to build schools, universities, hospitals, and factories. Africa would lead in medicine. Cures discovered in African labs would be shipped to the world. Africa would lead in technology, new inventions in energy. Transport and space exploration would come from African companies. African astronauts would be the first to step on the moon, and Mars carrying flags of their own nations. Not foreign ones. Picture the balance of power. Without colonization, Europe would not have risen so quickly. Without African gold, coal, and labor, the Industrial Revolution might have happened in Africa first. The ports of Cape Coast and Zanzibar, buzzing with machines, factories, and innovation. Africa could have been the hub that connected Europe, Asia, and the Americas through equal trade, making it the center of the global economy. In this timeline, African kingdoms might have united under one banner, forming a continental alliance, like the United States of Africa, a union of powerful nations that spoke with one voice. This union would have stopped wars between tribes and focused instead on growth, science, and peace. Africa would have stood as a shield against invaders, its army strong, its people united. No Berlin Conference, no foreign powers, drawing borders with a ruler on a map. Africa's borders would have grown naturally through cooperation and choice, not through blood and manipulation. The cultures of Africa would shine brighter than ever. Clothing filled with colors, designs inspired by tradition, but advanced into high fashion. African cuisine would dominate global restaurants. Jollof rice, injera, fufu, tagine, and more would be served as delicacies in Paris, New York, and Beijing. African spirituality and philosophy would influence the world just as much as Greek or Roman thought. Ubuntu. The idea that I am because we are would guide global politics, creating systems of respect and unity. Now imagine what this world would mean for science. Ancient African knowledge of plants, medicine, and the stars would not have been ignored. It would have been expanded. African universities might have discovered electricity long before Europe. African ships might have crossed the Atlantic before Columbus. African doctors might have cured diseases that plagued the world centuries ago. This Africa would not just catch up with the rest of the world. It would lead it, shaping the very future of humanity. Think about the world map today. How different it would look. Africa would not be carved into 54 countries by outsiders, but organized in its own way. Maybe fewer nations, maybe stronger alliances, perhaps a few giant empires covering vast regions, maybe even one united Africa stretching from Cairo to Cape Town. Speaking in many tongues, but united by power and pride in this world, migration would look different. Millions of people from Europe and Asia might move to Africa, not to take, but to seek opportunity. Africa would be the land of dreams, the place people went to find wealth and new life. The streets of Lagos or Addis Ababa, buzzing with foreigners, hoping for a better tomorrow. The culture of Africa would be global. The drums, the dances, the proverbs, the fashion, the art, not as things borrowed or stolen, but as trends led by Africans themselves. Hollywood might not be the center of entertainment. Nollywood, or its alternative, would lead the industry. African stories, kings, queens, heroes, myths, and legends would fill the world's screens. Children everywhere would grow up hearing not just about Hercules or Thor, but about Sundiata, Mansa, Musa Ya Asantewa, and Queen Nzinga. Maybe even the Marvel superheroes would be African-born, shaped by African imagination, with Wakanda, not as fiction, but as reality. Africa, untouched by colonization, would also mean Africa free of poverty, free of dependency, free of broken systems forced by outsiders. Instead, it would have built systems of its own governments, created in African traditions, economies designed for African people. no artificial borders, causing endless wars, no exploitation, leaving nations weak. Instead, Africa would be strong, balanced and respected. The shameful image that colonization created would never exist. No one would dare call Africa poor, backward, or primitive, because the truth would be too clear. Africa would be powerful, advanced, and free. Now, imagine how the rest of the world would treat Africa in this version of history. Countries would come to Africa with respect. They would come to ask for alliances, for trade, for knowledge, not to take, but to learn. Africa would set the prices for gold, oil, diamonds, not outsiders. Africa would control its destiny, its future, its story without apology. What about culture today? The music you hear on the radio, the clothes you wear, the language you speak. Much of it would carry African influence not as flavor but as foundation. Africa's culture would be the standard. African rhythms would be the basis of classical music. African designs, the model for global fashion. African architecture, the guide for building cities. Perhaps as the world's tallest buildings would rise in Africa, first reflecting both tradition and modern genius. And the most important part, Africa's people would walk with pride. Children growing up not feeling colonized or inferior, but confident, strong and ready to lead because their ancestors were never broken, never chained, never silenced in this world. Black skin would never be linked to slavery or suffering, but to royalty, leadership, and innovation in this world. Africa would not be called the Dark Continent. It would be called the Shining Continent, the place where light, knowledge, and power rise to guide humanity. And yet, as we think about this, what if we realize something powerful? Even though Africa was colonized, even though history tried to break it, the spirit of Africa still survives. The music, the art, the stories, the resilience, the wisdom, they are still here, alive and waiting to shine. The what if may not have happened, but the future is still open. The story of Africa is not finished. Maybe the dream of an uncolonized Africa can still live in the generations to come. If they rise, unite, and build a future where Africa is not begging, but leading, where Africa is not silent, but speaking, where Africa is not hidden, but shining. That is the true power of this question. What if Africa was never colonized? It makes us see not only the past, but the future, and it tells us the truth. Africa has always been great. It can be great again. And maybe maybe one day, the world will finally see the Africa that was meant to be.